At Hromadske, we are eager to give the floor to the government to speak. Our journalists talk to the representatives of all the ruling parties and the present administration. But currently their strategy is not to comment for the record, both for local and international audience. While a lot of the anti-corruption activists and the MPs are accused by some of the Ukrainian media and government officials of using the anti-corruption fight for their own benefit, self-promotion, and even to receive Western money. This is the discussion we have here in Ukraine. And this is what we want to talk about. And we are joined in the studio by Transparency International Olena Trigup, who is currently the Secretary General of the Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Committee. Previously, Olena had been working for the Ministry of Economy. And as well, media analyst Alexei Panich. Alexei is a philosopher. He is a member of the Ukrainian Public Broadcasting Board, but as well a political commentator who is very critical to those criticizing the government during the time of the war, I would say, if it's fair. So thanks a lot for coming. And, you know, these events are very connected. We will talk later to the anti-corruption agencies and the whole things which is happening this week. But maybe starting with Olena, really, do you consider these particular events critical for the anti-corruption fight? You know, because the headlines of the Western media are sometimes like that the president is fighting somebody who is fighting anti-corruption.
Well, from the first look, of course, there are two parallel stories. One story is Saakashvili, story as a politician here in Ukraine and his personal fight against the president. Another story, which is much more significant, it's a fight of current, incumbent government against anti-corruption movement overall, anti-corruption institutions that were formally set up after revolution, and also the anti-corruption NGOs. And of course, the fact that Saakashvili campaign and those anti-corruption movement participants, they had the same, basically, demands to stop the corruption, to establish the proper justice system. And they were seen together at the rallies. And right now, as you were quoting this article, they are reduced to Russian agents. This is a very worrisome sign, because this is absolutely wrong. Of course, people who fight corruption in Ukraine, they are pro-Ukrainian, they are actually heroes of Ukraine. And I would say that corrupt officials are Putin agents in Ukraine, vice versa. So I think this is just a strategy, unfortunately, of the government to frame it this way in order to fight back, since the anti-corruption movement really succeeded recently. And we are very close to establishing of the anti-corruption court by the end of this year. And instead we're witnessing this major pushback when NABU is under attack, when SAPO is under attack, when this law was supposed to be introduced, but luckily then it was taken out from the agenda in the parliament, which would put these newly independent institutions under control of the public authorities.
Alexei, and what would you say? And sometimes you say that, you know, this way of fighting corruption and, you know, protesting isn't really helping to the reforms. And sometimes the anti-corruption activists are either overdoing or following somebody's agenda?
Well, I would say indeed there are very different anti-corruption activists with very different agendas, very different ideals, very different strategies. And not all of them are equally helpful. Some of them, I would say, are rather discrediting the anti-corruption movement. For example, if we reduce all the anti-corruption struggle to replacing the president, just label one person as a huckster and replace him and everything will be all right, this is dangerous. This is not anti-corruption struggle. It cannot be that simple, you know.
So, particularly in the case of Saakashvili, so
yes,
what is your position?
Exactly. On the other hand, nobody would call an agent of Kremlin some people who are amending the law, who are proposing some amendments to a law, which a creator of Prozora system. Nobody would call them Kremlin activists, right? Or Kremlin agents. So if we take a long-term strategy with amending the law, proposing new law, opposing destruction of the already created anti-corruption laws. This is okay. If we say just replace this guy by another guy and it will be all right, or if we say let's get all oligarchs out of Ukraine or out of power at all, it's too simple to be true.
But what you would say about the ways and the tools the government does it? Because that sometimes is said that, you know, the general prosecutor isn't really an independent person.
I would say for the government, sometimes it's also helpful to oversimplify the case and to blame all the anti-corruption activists. But on the other hand, those who simplified from the anti-corruption, from the side of anti-corruption movement, help the government to make the struggle meaningless, either anti-corruption or against anti-corruption movement. So the real strategic course is to switch to more long-term plans, to very specific work with legislation, lobbying, legislative changes, and if it doesn't work, let's ask people support not just anti-oligarch slogans, but something more particular.
Olena, you used to work for the government as a reformer. You resigned, so was it really possible for you to do that through this way, rather than being an outsider who criticized the president? Because Transparency International is a really strong critic.
Yes, of course. I actually had to leave the government precisely because I felt I was at the point when I couldn't make a lot of change inside the government, and that there is much more sense to stay outside the government. And I can say that what I've seen in the government is that there is one particular issue which is preventing the reforms, and it's corruption, or the interests of different stakeholders who don't want those reforms to disrupt their different sources of revenue. You know how Transparency International defines corruption? It's abuse of entrusted power for the private gain. And I have seen it a lot. And essentially, every time when I was implementing some reform-related measures to the International Development Cooperation, I saw that there were some avenues that would touch interests of some concrete individuals who are in public authorities, and I would be stopped and I would be, immediately attacked for touching those particular areas. And that's why I think this is the major problem. And European Union, last week after what happened, after this attack on Nabu, on Soboli firing, they said that actually anti-corruption and fighting corruption will mean that other reforms will be able to succeed. If not, other reforms will be stopped. It's a key issue for Ukraine right now, and everybody understood it already.
Alexei, and how would you differentiate the good anti-corruption activist from the bad anti-corruption activist?
Well, I would say that if you wish the long-term benefit for your country, you would not make a civil conflict. You will not sharp it in the times of war, the first thing. Where we cannot manage, we cannot afford doing war with Russia and fighting with all the force, all the possible force, anti-corruption at the same time. So it's a long-term task. You cannot, we all wish to have some quick and visible successes in an anti-corruption struggle. I have a bad news for you. It's a long-term task. It's for years and years. If you want to do it quick, all you can do is authoritarianism, and then you will take a disaster, because there is a war and Russia is behind.
Well, actually, I would like to say that if we don't fight corruption, we are going to lose the war.
Of course.
And this is what the organization I work with, the Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Committee, that's what we are focusing on. We right now have around $3 billion of defense budget, and most of it in terms of procurement is classified. This classification, this secrecy, which is justified actually by war, is used by our public officials for corruption. And essentially, there is this urgency to fight corruption precisely because we are at war, and we are a country, we are right now vulnerable. And that's why we have to be very serious towards our policymakers, people in power, and demand that they stop this corruption, because our country is under threat. It's not a joke anymore. Part of our territory was taken away. Right now, another part is being, not in our control. At the same time, here, officials in Kiev, they live just the way they used to live before the revolution and before the war.
That's true. But if we sharpen the situation up to the point of open civil conflict, it will not help.
No,
it will make things worse, even worse. But Saakashvili, that's what he wants. That's what he claims.
Alexei, wasn't at some point you were supporting Saakashvili when he was appointed as a governor of Odesa and kind of supporting the line of the president? It was the president who established him.
I was more or less critical about him from the beginning, actually. Even when he was in Georgia, I would say that his ways of fighting corruption in Georgia were not quite reliable and not quite legal. As you know, people were tortured, people were beaten, people were killed. So it's too dear a price. In the time, you can beat corruption using authoritarian power for a while, like Mussolini in Sicily, like Stalin. In the times of Stalin, you didn't hear much about corruption. It was not the main problem of Stalin's time. But when authoritarianism steps back, corruption goes back into its place if society is not less tolerable to corruption. But you cannot change a society just like that.
How do you describe the system when the law enforcement is following the orders of the president and particularly coming into the fight with somebody who has the fight with the president? Isn't really something not that, and in a way that the General Prosecutor Office is dealing the General Prosecutor, Yuri Lutsenko, who is the closest ally of the president, to what extent is it really the democratic way of, fighting these people like Saakashvili?
It depends on whether the charges against Saakashvili are really criminal or purely political. I am thinking about it. I am not ready to say it's just political. And if you are fighting against the president, if you are fighting for power, it doesn't mean you are free from any political accusations, any criminal accusations. It doesn't mean that. You don't have a protection just because you participate in a political struggle. And if Saakashvili committed a crime and it can be proved in the court of law, okay, let it be so.
Is it political?
Yeah. Well, but if it's not proven, it will be actually a disaster, not just for our government, but for our country, because this will essentially lead us to this situation of civil unrest that you're talking about, because then if our government loses legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens and also the Western partners, it's a very dangerous situation, and we are attacked by Russia. It's a very dangerous situation. So we are here right now on a very thin ice, because this investigation against Saakashvili should be done properly, and if it will turn out that those tapes are not authentic, or that he is not, this process is not, fair, and it will be really, really bad for the whole country.
I would also ask our team to show today's protests, which were taking place in Kiev. I went to the street also to see and just to feel, because some of the protests are radical. I should admit there were a lot of people coming from the regions, but there were also some Kiev residents and as well a mid-age, and it was less radical that one could say. That you can see on our video. So how it looked, not just like far right or some really adherent supporters, though they were there. And we also asked the questions to the people who come. It's up to the audience to decide, and make their own impression to what people feel.
So you came here to support this rally, right?
Well, I'm against our government's rowdiness in relation to Saakashvili.
In your opinion, are these meetings an effective way of fighting, or is acting in a political and legal manner better?
Well, in my opinion, I would take all these people and direct them to the security service of Ukraine headquarters on Askoldiv Lane, and with the use of direct democracy, free Saakashvili, because since the detention has been unlawful, we can use the same methods to get him back. Moreover, regardless of whether I like Saakashvili or not, he appeals to me as a chime, as a buzzer that could awaken the Ukrainian nation to the lawlessness of our government.
These rallies happen quite regularly.
Yes, and I come here often too, and every time I get more and more disappointed by all these empty talks. I'm more of an action person. 4 years ago, the stage was there, and all the morons that used to stand on that stage are now in power. Something similar is happening now. The stage is limited access, only for their clique. All the slots have been allocated. You understand, the people are the ones who need to elect, instead of these people self-electing themselves. Try going on the stage now to speak. Do you think they will let you?
What was the reason you came here? Let's talk and walk at the same time, if that's okay.
We'll talk in turns because we're different people. First off, Poroshenko is not my president. I want a president whom I respect and can take pride in, and he's a thief. He can't save our country from corruption. He's the one who creates corruption himself and defends it. We can talk about this at length. There is so much to list.
So today you came to protest against the president, or do you support Saakashvili as well?
I am against the president, and I 100% support Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Artem Sitnik is our pride for me today. He's the person we can just admire and be proud of. These are the people we can take pride in, not Poroshenko.
What do you think of Saakashvili's detention?
Saakashvili's detention? Well, I think it's shameful. It's shameful for Poroshenko first and foremost. To seize a global leader in such a way by demonstrating their power. He just showed his lunacy in this, nothing more. You can talk to my friend here too.
So we listened to the people who were really critical to the government, and you can feel some genuinity of what they said.
I actually have a response to Elena. I would say that you may be surprised, but I do believe that for Ukrainian government, this situation with Saakashvili is win-win. Because either the court will say that he is indeed committed a criminal crime, that means the general prosecution was right. And if the court will find him not guilty, glory to Ukrainian independent court system. It means that there is no authoritarianism, we are building democracy.
Let's see how independent it is. This week, the Ukrainian Parliament took aim at the country's anti-corruption agencies, as it was mentioned before. On December 6, the Petro Poroshenko bloc and the Narodny Front political parties introduced a bill that would remove the independent Artem Sitnik from the leadership of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. The bill sparked immediate criticism from both Ukrainian reformist and Ukraine's Western partners. They alleged the bill was a means to undermine the anti-corruption agency's independence. But after a night of frantic phone calls, the reformers scored a victory. The parliament removed the bill from its agenda, but that night the parliament struck back. It voted to dismiss Yegor Sobolev, the chair of its anti-corruption committee. The aborted bill and Sobolev's removal comes as an authority's latest attack on the country's anti-corruption agencies. So to learn more, you can read our articles at en.hromadske.uk to go to details. But Olena, the word for you really, how do you see serious is that? And I'll definitely have the question also to Alexei about the role of the Western partners.
Well, in 2014, Ukraine are committed to create a system of independent anti-corruption institution. It's an ecosystem which needs to have certain elements to work properly. It's the National Agency for Corruption Prevention, it's the NABU investigative body, it's the Special Prosecution for Anti-Corruption, and it's a Higher Anti-Corruption Court. Until recently, this system was not really functional. NABU was the main engine of this system, the one that was actually functioning, and we saw a lot of high-level cases against current officials. Corruption Prevention Agency, we saw these recent scandals with the whistleblower Solomatinova. She actually said that the work of this agency is sabotaged and controlled by Bankova, which should be investigated. This is a major, major allegation. And as you know, Western partners invested so much in e-declarations and this system, and we actually got visa-free regime for this e-declaration system. So what we see is happening, the West was pressuring a lot our current government to establish the final element of the ecosystem, anti-corruption court. Because these high-level cases that NABU brought to courts, they are all, pending. Nobody is in jail. So finally, when our government said, President numerously said he will do it, he will do it, he will do it, and we'll see that deadline is approaching, and instead what we see the government starting to do, they try to dismantle this system which was already created, and actually the one which is functioning well, NABU. So of course, that's why IMF, European Commission, United States Department of State, they all made official announcements that what we see the attack on anti-corruption system. It's very clear, it was really evident.
Alexei, what is your take on that, in particular the fact that you're pretty critical to those anti-corruption activists and members of parliament
who against all anti-corruption activists and agencies.
I mean like that, those who kind of complain to the Western government about wrongdoings back home.
Well, we need the support of Western governments. Sometimes they do the role of judges who can define who is right and who is wrong in Ukraine and help us to create a healthy democratic system. I'm here in the middle ground, actually. For example, I support the dismissal of Yegor Sobolev. On the other hand, why? Because in my impression, he was too much manipulating with his authorities in the Anti-Corruption Committee. He used it too much for his own PR, for his promotion of his own political agenda. It's not the same. So on the one hand. On the other hand, I would not support the new draft, which would subordinate the NABU to the parliament. It's a bad thing. It's too much dependence. At the same time, I would say NABU couldn't be totally independent. At least it should be dependent on the law. And it cannot break the law. And again, if Lutsenko is right that NABU broke the law in some steps, it should be prosecuted. It should be punished for this.
I would like also to show the photos from another protest which has happened the day before in front of the house of the Ukrainian General Prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko. There were a number of various people coming, including the anti-corruption activist who speaks about his mansion. You can see that on the photos, saying that the General Prosecutor, the closest ally to the President, and as well he used to be the political prosecuted person during the Yanukovych time, is currently leading this fight against anti-corruption activists. That happened a day before, but we also have the quote from Yuri Lutsenko himself. He prefers not really to answer the questions to the journalists, but write the things at his Facebook. But we definitely are very eager to for our audience to listen what the General Prosecutor of Ukraine says.
I always work on Saturdays. While these exalted fighters were rallying, I carried out an emergency meeting on solving the problem of exchanging our prisoners of war. I feel calm about all opinions of me, including those that are critical. I leave the moral consequences of rallying out my place of residence to the conscience of these so-called activists. First off, I do all my work honestly. Secondly, unlike their idol Saakashvili, I never fled my country. As an author of the corresponding law, I definitely know this. The country needs NABU, but all the law enforcement institutions, including NABU, need to cooperate within the law. If the anti-corruption lawmakers try to solve obvious legal issues within the work of obscure NABU employees by carrying out a rally, my wife will have to make corresponding alterations to the law.
What would you say also? You just mentioned Ukrainian General Prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko and said that the attacks shouldn't be aimed at the personalities. But in that case, would you support him? And do you really consider that anti-corruption activists really do that for, I don't know, receiving foreign grants or the self-promotion?
No, it's a childish action, actually. I would not take it too seriously. What I'm serious about is another thing. I would say that a year ago, all our politicians and our anti-corruption activists made a capital mistake. We created a system of new anti-corruption agencies, and we didn't pass the law on amnesty of capital, so-called zero declaration. We didn't forgive previous economic crimes. What happens now without this law? It gives the new anti-corruption agencies the power which much exceeds their formal competency. Actually, there are too much crimes, economical crimes committed now and committed before, and crimes that exist now and the roots of them are years before. And there is a wide choice. The leader of NABU can investigate this crime today, this crime tomorrow, and it's up to his discretion. It's his choice. He cannot investigate all these crimes at once, too much of them. It means that he is killer of political reputations, and all the politicians depend on him, and he depends on nobody. It's not a normal situation.
And Olena, what is your take on that? We'll be rounding.
Well, my take on this is when you describe conflict between Prosecutor General and NABU. Look what happened. Their operation was undermined, NABU operation. If it was a conflict which was just, as you said, NABU broke the law, usually how would law enforcement agency or Prosecutor General office, how they would behave? They would just, stop the operation. They would internally investigate it. Instead, what Prosecutor General office did and SBU, they exposed secret agents. Then they raided 12 houses of those people who worked for NABU, their relatives, with searches. It's essentially a political action, the way they did it. They did it to basically kill the reputation of NABU and to basically convince society that NABU is not good. And it's very, of course, wrong, and it's very dangerous approach, because this is not law we're talking about politics.
Olena and Alexei, thanks a lot. I think our audience enjoyed this discussion. It's taking place in Ukraine all over the place, and it's not one show discussion. Thanks a lot for being with us.